So I'm going to just start us off with a bit of an introduction, and then we're going to move through to having WorkSafe speak about certain aspects of the integration of the guidelines and also water and environmental regulation. I have on hand a laboratory specialist, Max Dees from Eurofins, a manager at Eurofins, a manager at Eurofins, which most of you know probably. He's helped us with some project work that we've been doing that's part of a master's work that I'm doing around doing some monitoring around different situations of non-occupational exposure. And we spent quite a bit of time with him in the early days setting up reporting structures and sort of talking a lot about AS sampling and reporting and working towards putting some of those things that we discussed into the update. So he's my lab expert that I've got in the room to answer those kind of questions as well. So just to start us off, the approach we've taken with the guidelines, and this was even early on, was to identify contamination as early as we can in the piece. So if we're looking at contaminated sites or other works that are happening at a site, the idea is to identify that contamination as early as possible and manage it effectively. I'm sure you've been involved with sites where it wasn't identified early enough and it spread through the site and the problem becomes more expensive and more problematic to deal with. So we still have that approach of trying to identify contamination early. These guidelines are the primary reference for contaminated sites management in Western Australia. So while we have the NEPM, we tend to prefer that you follow the guidelines with respect to how you manage contaminated sites, and they go beyond what the NEPM does anyway. The principles that we've adopted in these guidelines since their introduction in 2009, and in fact even since the draft came out in 2008, they've been used in other areas, so non-contaminated site areas. And that includes looking at assessment of construction and demolition waste that's been recycled, looking at validation criteria for that, looking at waste criteria, landfill waste criteria. Some of the sampling strategies have been adopted into that work, determining what is asbestos waste, and also in our incident response. So I've already kind of referred to that, but fire response, incidences of high pressure water of asbestos cement roofs, which tend to contaminate not just the property where that occurred, but the surrounding properties, and storm damage and cyclone events. So the principles are used for soil assessment and validation in those areas, but they don't necessarily have to be reported or comply with the other contaminated sites requirements. And Bill's going to talk a bit more about when you would need to report and when you don't need to report a site. You might think asbestos is a problem of the past. Well, this is a slide that we got from ASEA recently in a summit to do with Asbestos Awareness Week. It's an update to the estimated flows of asbestos in the environment, and it includes basically supply, use, etc. And you can see that basically we're at our highest usage now, 2020. And the flows go down now because basically we've reached the end of product life for many of these products. So asbestos, great products, lasted a really long time. If you have an asbestos cement roof, you've had the same roof for more than 40 years in many cases, and it's lasted you. But these things are now very much at the end of their productive life. So from 2020 onwards, you can see the estimate is that we're going to start taking these out of use, and the last place we want them to end up is in our soils, in our backyards, incorrectly disposed of, in our recycled products. So the management of asbestos waste, contamination and in our recycling will become even more critical, I think, in the upcoming decades. So that's a job at least till I retire, and probably for most of us in the room as well. So it will be critical to manage this flow of asbestos away from use and into the sort of waste, soil, recycling kind of world that it might impact. Just a little bit on mesothelioma. I was asked by someone to include a bit of disease information. You can see in terms of the number of cases of mesothelioma, we're still being very much impacted by asbestos workers who get mesothelioma. There's still, Whitney workers who are alive and who can't come up with new cases of mesothelioma through their lives. We have quite a number of unknown exposure histories, and as you can imagine, if you've got a 40+ year lag time in some instances, it can be quite difficult to remember anything in your life but it might not have stood out to you at the time as asbestos or an exposure to asbestos, so it may be quite difficult to identify. And also, we've just lost Dr. Bill Musk recently, who was part of the asbestos research group at UWA, and he started off us in WA with the first mesothelioma register, and he was excellent at getting a really good history of all the patients that came into him. And I think over time we've kind of lost that, you know, with Whitney becoming a legacy, we kind of lost that ability to really get really good exposure history data. So I think that's something that we probably have to sort of pick the ball up on and keep, you know, in the air, is getting really good exposure histories around people who come in with lung diseases and lung-related illnesses. You can see there's a little DIY group there, so that's your home renovators, and I'll talk a bit later on about the risk associated with home renovation, and that is definitely something which is why we have our public health legislation. That is a big concern for us here at the department, is people who are working on existing asbestos cement products who are going to have higher exposures even to those people who may be, you know, around contaminated sites. You've got Whitney residents there, which gives you some indication of the relative risk associated with being a resident, although they've had quite a significant exposure as well, in that much of the covering material in the town was old tailings, etc. And we're talking about crucidolite, the most potent fibre for mesothelioma. So we don't really have a clear picture of sort of background on occupational exposure from other scenarios like contaminated sites, but as we sort of go over in time, you can see there's some sort of projected disease rates over time. The red dots are the cases that are occurring now, but there is an expectation that, you know, after regulation 1985 and banning in 2003, that some of that exposure, those larger exposure events won't have occurred, and that the mesothelioma rates will drop down. And you can see you've got sort of like a little sort of aqua line there, that's our renovators. And you can see as time goes on, they may actually be, you know, a more significant proportion of people that might not have mesotheliomas in the future. And that's why SEER and ourselves are really focused on keeping asbestos awareness going. So because of this focus around, you know, asbestos and where it is a risk, we really felt with this update to the guidelines that we needed to get a more cohesive means of having the contaminated sites guidelines work with the existing legislative framework around prevention of exposure to asbestos. And so that's the reason for this new chapter in the update. You know, I think I said it in infinitum when I met people and talked about contaminated sites. There are other regulations you need to know about. So if you're a contaminated site consultant, you need to be aware of the whole legislative structure around asbestos, because there are a number of departments and a number of pieces of legislation that work together to manage exposure to asbestos. So it's not that if you don't manage it at a contaminated site, people are going to get exposed. I've heard that. Well, that's not the fact. You've got other pieces of legislation that manage exposure to asbestos, and they must also be complied with. So this new chapter really puts that focus back on prevention of contamination. So what we would have expected to see since the introduction of the Contaminated Sites Act is that we should stop seeing contaminated sites with asbestos, because that should be a legacy issue. What we don't want to be seeing is new sites. What we want to be seeing is robust removal practices, robust waste control practices that mean that we don't end up with new contaminated sites. So we really are putting a heavy focus on get the removal right in the first place. And you can use the existing WHS legislation or public health legislation to get that done. We know that controlled and compliant removal work will prevent any debris left in soil and any introduction of asbestos into recycled products. We expect the whole process to be a really consultative process. So some of the issues that we've found is that if work is done in isolation around assessment and management of a contaminated site, the control of that land might go to someone like a local government authority, say for example for natural bushland that's been cleaned up, or for a site that's going for redevelopment, or for public open space. And you know, contaminated sites consultants like to put, if they can do any containment, they like to put it in the public open space and give it to local government to manage, because they have the procedures in place to be able to do that in perpetuity. But you can't and shouldn't do that without discussing what the containment procedure is and what the expected site management plan is with the local government first, because they are going to be left dealing with it for the next you know, for the rest of the time that asbestos is in situ, which is probably forever. So you really need to be in discussion with those stakeholders when you develop your remedial options, and try to make that really explicit and clear in this update. The legislation doesn't really force you to do that, as well as, you know, I guess us at Department of Health would like, but, you know, we're not, through the guidelines, I guess, the thing to remember is we're not looking for minimum standard, we're looking for you to be thoughtful in your process and to do good management through your process. And also, community is an important stakeholder, and I'll talk a bit later about how risk communication is an important part of what you do and how you can address that with the community. So I'm not going to talk much about WA test legislation, that's not my field, and we have Thayers here to talk about it in a moment in a bit more detail. But just to highlight what WA test legislation does, it allows for people to have registers for any place that's a workplace, and so that includes a lot of places. A lot of places can be designated as workplaces under the WA test legislation, a lot of buildings, a lot of facilities. And for those places, you need a register, you need assessment of the products in situ, you need a licence for removal of those, people can't be exposed. Most importantly, you need to correctly dispose of things and notify of exposure instance, but most importantly are these two things from the perspective of contaminated site consultants. When a removal work is complete, the work asbestos area must be left in a clean state. Now, if that happens and you have a good, proper clearance inspection at the end of a removal job and a good report, there should be evidence that that has occurred. Some clearance reports I know aren't up to that kind of standard, but that's something that the work health and safety agencies are working on and asbestos assessors in the industry are working on. Records must be kept. So that idea of the clearance inspection report being kept and maybe handed on to the next owner of a property, so that if there is you know, redevelopment of the site and someone does need to do a contaminated site review, before the redevelopment, they will have those records available at the PSI stage to say, yep, there was a removal job done, we've got the asbestos removal control plan, so we can see that it was all done properly, we've got the clearance inspection report, we've got the disposal receipts, this is really good evidence at the PSI desktop stage that asbestos may not be a problem for us at this site, so your subsequent site investigations may prove simpler and easier, although there are no guarantees you won't find asbestos. So this asbestos removal control plan, fabulous document, basically really good if you need to do any removal work. So even if you're a contaminated site consultant, if there's any debris, you know, you can get into the sort of removal field as well, because there may not be a good understanding from the people that are doing removal work around developing procedures for removal of asbestos in soil. So, you know, proactive work is better to look for than reactive work, I think. So there is a need, I think, for some contaminated site consultant knowledge in the preparation of asbestos removal control plans around managing debris in soils. You've got, for roofs, you'll have to look at things like water tank sediments, soak wells and roof drip lines that might be areas of contamination, particularly for very large acreage roofs. Obviously, it's good to have people that have learned from contaminated sites to be involved in incident response and clean-up to make sure that that's done appropriately in a way that's consistent with how well we clean things up with contaminated sites. And for any removal work, we always encourage clients to be part of the final inspection to make sure that they're happy that any debris and materials have been removed from the site. And we also think that there's a place in clearance certificates for soil validation if that's been part of the whole removal process. So there's been talk, you know, nationally, I know, amongst assessors about getting assessors in as early as possible to help write the asbestos removal control plan, so that when they do the clearance at the end, they can tick off on all those things quite well that they've been done, including any validation and clean-up of soil. Like I say, it doesn't have to go to the extent of a contaminated site validation work, but it should cover what's in the asbestos removal control plan, which you can think of in the same way as a remediation plan, but specific for removal work. So this is the body of guidance that's available across WA for very different issues, whether you're a resident, whether you're a worker. whether it's about new products, etc. We've included this table in the guidelines. Obviously, it's on us now to keep this up to date, and hopefully we'll be able to do that. This has got good feedback having this table in there, and I want to make a personal acknowledgement at this point to John Howell, who's a prolific writer of guidance within our section, Environmental Health Directorate, and is probably responsible for most of those documents that sit in the public health area. So thanks to John, who's I know listening online, thanks to all the work you've done over the past, and he also put out the original guidelines. So shout out to John Howell for that.